They thought I was weak, that age had robbed me of my power. When they tricked me into signing what they thought was an empty will, they couldn't stop celebrating. Little did they know, I had one last trick up my sleeve. While they toasted to their inheritance, I was already 5 steps ahead, preparing a plan that would ruin everything they thought they knew. They laughed at me, mocked my years, and underestimated my will. But in the end, they would learn. It was never about the money. It was about making them pay for their betrayal. It was a bright afternoon when they came, all smiles and feigned concern, acting as if they still cared. My children, my own flesh and blood. They sat across from me, pretending to be supportive, offering me their condolences about my old age. But behind those smiles, I could feel it. The greed, the impatience, the desire to get their hands on what they thought was rightfully theirs. They spoke in hushed tones, eyes darting to my will like vultures circling their prey. Don't worry, Dad. We've got it all handled. You don't need to worry about a thing, my daughter said, her voice dripping with false kindness. She knew I was slowing down, that I wasn't the man I once was, but what she didn't know was that I still had control. And this was far from over. As the lawyer slid the empty will in front of me, I saw the excitement in their eyes. They thought they had me cornered, that I had no strength left to fight back. They didn't know about the secret will I had locked away in a lawyer's safe, the one that would make them pay for every cruel word, every insult. I signed it, making it official. But in my mind, I was already plotting my revenge. They had no idea that this empty will would be their undoing, the catalyst for their destruction. I could feel their smirks, their quiet celebration, and I had to keep my face neutral. In that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just about the inheritance, this was about my dignity. And they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Now I know what you're thinking. How could they be so blind? Well, let me ask you this. What would you do if your own family turned on you like this? What would you do if they mocked your age, belittled your worth, and tried to take everything you'd worked for? Let me know in the comments below because, trust me, you're about to see how I turn the tables on them. And if you think I'm right for teaching them a lesson, hit that like button. I'll need to know I'm not alone in this. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe, because I have more stories coming your way, stories that will make you rethink trusting anyone. I was never one to let life's hardships get me down. As a young man, I built my life from nothing, working long hours in the factory and saving every penny I could. I wanted something better for my family, something they could inherit, something they could be proud of. My wife Martha and I worked together to make a home for our children, raising them with love and respect. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was all I thought we'd ever need. I remember the smell of Martha's cooking filling the house on cold winter nights, the crackling sound of the fire as we sat together, the warmth in her eyes. We weren't rich, but we had everything we needed, and we built a life that was meaningful, a life based on hard work and loyalty. I recall one night, after a long day's work, sitting in the living room with my kids, watching the fire dance. They were young then, innocent, and full of hope. I was proud of the life I'd built. My son, Thomas, used to sit on my knee and tell me about his big plans for the future. "Dad, when I grow up, I'll be just like you," he would say, his eyes bright with ambition. Martha and I often talked about how we would pass on everything we had to them, hoping they'd appreciate it, hoping they'd be able to carry on the legacy we had started. But little did I know, the very children I had worked so hard to support would one day turn their backs on me when I needed them the most. The first cracks in our family's bond appeared when I was diagnosed with heart disease. It wasn't severe at first, just enough to slow me down, to remind me that time was catching up with me. I had to scale back on work, and that's when the tension began. At first, it was subtle, the little comments here and there. "Dad, you're not as sharp as you used to be. Maybe it's time to step back and let us handle things." I brushed it off, thinking they were just worried about me. But the truth was, they were already eyeing the future, a future that would soon be theirs for the taking. I had always been the pillar of strength for them. I was the one they turned to when they needed advice, when they needed a helping hand. But as my health began to fail, I found myself needing them more and more. And that's when I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. They weren't the same children I had raised. My son, once so full of promise, had grown distant. My daughter, always so sweet, now spoke to me as if I were a burden. And what hurt the most was how quickly they began to treat me like an afterthought, as if I had become invisible to them. The turning point came one afternoon when I was at the doctor's office. My heart wasn't doing well, and the doctor recommended a surgery. I wasn't sure if I was ready for it, but I knew it was my only option. When I told my children about it, they were quick to offer their support, or so they said. "Don't worry, Dad," Thomas said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We've got it covered. We'll take care of you." But I could see the truth in their eyes. They weren't worried about me. They were already thinking about what would happen when I was gone, about what they would inherit, how they could take everything I had built for themselves. I couldn't help but wonder, had they always been this way? Had I been so blind to their greed, so caught up in providing for them that I missed the warning signs? As I lay in bed recovering from the surgery, I began to feel a sense of betrayal settle in my chest. They didn't love me the way I loved them. They loved what I could give them. One night, as I sat alone in the dark, I started thinking about my will. I had always promised myself I'd take care of them when the time came. But what if they didn't deserve it? What if they had lost the right to inherit everything I'd worked so hard for? I couldn't shake the thought from my mind. I began to realize that I needed to take control, not just of my health, but of my legacy. Martha had passed a few years earlier, and though I missed her every day, I knew she would have understood. She always told me, family isn't just about blood, it's about loyalty. And I couldn't shake the feeling that loyalty had been lost along the way. It was then, in the quiet of that night, that I made my decision. I would rewrite my will, but not in a way they would expect. I didn't want them to get everything, not after the way they had treated me. It would be a will they'd never see coming, one that would change everything and leave them wondering where it all went wrong. I made plans to see an attorney, someone I trusted completely, to make sure everything was legally sound. But I didn't tell my children. They didn't need to know. They would find out the hard way, just like I had. The next few months were a blur of hospital visits, doctor's appointments, and the heavy realization that my time was running out. My health continued to deteriorate. But what hurt the most was the coldness I felt from my own family. It wasn't just that they were distant. It was the subtle ways they treated me like an inconvenience, as if my existence was something to endure rather than cherish. I could see it in their eyes. When they spoke to me in the way they avoided my questions about the future, or the lack of any real support beyond their half-hearted offers to help. Thomas, my son, was the one who hurt me the most. The boy who once looked up to me, the one who dreamed of following in my footsteps, now barely spared me a glance. The last time we had a real conversation, I asked him if he'd be taking over the family business. His response was lukewarm, at best. "I'll think about it, Dad. I've got bigger plans now. Things are different." The words stung more than I would admit, but I said nothing. What was there to say? He was no longer the man I had raised him to be, and I knew in my heart that the business I'd spent my life building didn't matter to him anymore. What mattered was what it could give him, what he could inherit once I was gone. My daughter, Elaine, had always been more affectionate, more compassionate. But even her kindness had started to feel transactional. There were no more thoughtful gestures, no more deep conversations like we used to have. Now she showed up only when it was convenient for her, offering me empty promises. "You're doing okay, Dad?" she would ask, her eyes never meeting mine for long. "If you need anything, let me know. Just don't want you to be a burden." The words were like daggers, even though they were wrapped in a pretty, polite package. The moment that really broke me came one evening when I overheard them talking in the next room. I wasn't supposed to be eavesdropping, but the door was cracked open, and I could hear them clearly. Elaine and Thomas were discussing the arrangements after my passing. "Dad's not doing well, and I don't think he's going to last much longer," Elaine said. "You know, once he's gone, we'll be set. The house, the business, everything will be ours. But we have to act fast. If he changes the will, that's going to be a problem." I froze, my heart sinking. The words, the cold calculations in their voices, shattered me. They weren't worried about me. They were already planning how to take everything, and they weren't even pretending anymore. I wanted to confront them, to scream at them and demand an explanation, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed silent, a heavy weight pressing on my chest. They didn't know I had already been making plans of my own. My trust in them had been shattered, and now I had no intention of letting them have what they thought they could easily take from me. That night, after they had gone to bed, I picked up the phone and called an old friend of mine, a lawyer I'd known for years, someone who had helped me with my business and personal matters in the past. I explained the situation in vague terms, not wanting to give too much away, but enough for him to understand that I needed a will, a real one, the kind that would leave nothing behind for my children. I needed it to be ironclad, so they couldn't contest it or manipulate their way into anything. He agreed to help me, and within weeks, I had the will drawn up, sealed, and stored in a safe place. The secret will was simple but precise. Everything would be left to charity, the causes I believed in, the people who had supported me throughout my life. The businesses I had worked so hard to build would go to loyal friends and partners who had stood by me, not to my children, who had shown nothing but greed. They would be left with nothing but their hollow promises. I held on to that will, knowing that one day my children would come for what they thought was theirs. They didn't realize I had already taken the most important thing back from them, my dignity. They would soon learn that betrayal has a price, and it was one they would pay dearly for. As the days passed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The tension I had lived with for so long began to lift. I knew what I had to do, and I knew that when the time came, I would make sure they understood the consequences of their actions. And so, I waited. I watched them, their smiles, their false concern. They had no idea what was coming, but when they did, it would be too late to stop it. They thought they had me trapped, that they had won, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. Dasen. Weeks that followed were filled with a sense of quiet satisfaction. I had a plan, and though it was hard to see them every day pretending nothing had changed, I knew I was biding my time. I stayed calm, outwardly grateful for their visits, for their so-called support. But inside, I was stewing, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, as I sat in my favorite chair, the one Martha had picked out for me all those years ago, I watched them like I always did. Elaine came over first, like she often did, bringing me some soup, though I could tell it was mostly for show, just a way for her to tick off a box on her list of duties. She asked how I was feeling, and when I told her I was fine, she didn't seem to believe me. Her eyes, though polite, scanned the room, checking for any signs of weakness, any clue that might hint I was getting worse. And then, with all the sincerity she could muster, she asked, "Have you updated your will, Dad?" The question, though casual, sent a chill down my spine. I was taken aback. They had never asked me that before, not outright. "I have everything in order," I said, coolly, offering no more detail. Her expression faltered for a moment, just a flicker. She quickly recovered, but I could see it, the gears turning behind her eyes. She was calculating, trying to figure out if I had done something behind their backs. But what she didn't know was that I had done far more than she could ever imagine. Then, Thomas showed up. I hadn't expected him so soon, but I could tell from his hurried steps and nervous energy that something was different. He walked in with a forced smile, trying to act as if he cared, but there was an unease about him. He sat down across from me, avoiding eye contact, as if he didn't want to reveal how much he was hoping for some indication that everything was still on track for his inheritance. "Dad, you know we've been talking about some things lately," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "We just want to make sure you're taking care of everything. You know, we don't want things to get complicated down the road." I stared at him, studying his face. The words were thinly veiled attempts to check if I had made any moves without telling them. He was worried. I could see it in his posture, his jittery hands. But I didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing anything. Instead, I leaned back and let the silence hang between us. "I told you, Thomas. Everything's fine," I replied firmly, making sure my voice carried weight. "I've been around long enough to know when it's time to plan ahead." The frustration flickered across his face, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. But that was quickly replaced by a sense of justice, knowing that he would soon realize that he was the one who had underestimated me. They still thought they had control, still thought that they were in the driver's seat. They didn't realize how far I had planned ahead. Later that evening, as they left, I overheard them talking outside the door. I didn't mean to listen, but I couldn't help it. I caught snippets of their conversation, the quiet whispers between them, still unsure whether I was aware of their manipulations. Elaine asked Thomas what would happen if I decided to change my mind, to sign another will that left everything to someone else. Thomas, sounding a little panicked, assured her, "No way, he's too stubborn. If he were going to do something, he'd have already done it." That was the moment it hit me. They were so confident, so sure of themselves. They thought I was weak, incapable of standing up for myself. They didn't realize the power I still had, or that I had already set the stage for their downfall. As the days passed, I continued to watch them. They would come by, pretending to care, but the tension was unbearable. I could see the way they looked at me, the way they measured my every word and action, trying to decipher if I was hiding something from them. Little did they know. Their fear was growing inside of them, slowly consuming them as they waited for the moment when I'd finally give in. But I wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. As I sat in my chair one evening, alone with my thoughts, I made my final preparations. The attorney would be the one to deliver the blow. When the time came, I would have no regrets, no second thoughts. The secret will was in place, and the moment they discovered it, everything would change. They would be left with nothing. No inheritance, no home, no business. All of it would go to the people who had supported me, the ones who truly deserved it. But before that happened, I needed to let them think they were winning. I needed them to believe they had outsmarted me. That would make the revenge all the sweeter when it came. They had no idea what was about to hit them. The days stretched on like a slow-burning fuse, and my children's attempts to keep me in the dark, and more importantly, their belief that I was unaware, began to intensify. It was clear they had no intention of changing their ways. Each day they'd call or visit with their thinly veiled questions, dropping hints, testing me to see if I'd reveal anything. But I held steady, never once giving them the satisfaction of knowing what I was really planning. I was done with being the passive observer in my own life. They had manipulated me long enough. One afternoon, about a week after our last encounter, Elaine arrived at my door with a package in hand. I wasn't expecting a visit, but she came in without knocking, as though she had a right to be there. She was wearing her business attire, her sharp heels clicking against the floor as she entered. The scent of her perfume, strong and overpowering, followed her inside. "Dad," she said, forcing a smile, "I've been thinking about what we discussed last time." I didn't say anything at first. Instead, I gestured for her to sit. She seemed tense, her movements stiff, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. I watched her, watching her discomfort. There was a time when I would have jumped to reassure her, to offer comfort in the face of her anxieties. But now I was enjoying the role reversal. The predator and the prey had shifted. She slid the package across the table, her eyes darting nervously from it to me. "I've been looking into ways to ensure everything is in order. You know, legally." She paused, as if weighing her next words. "Carefully. We just want to make sure there are no complications with your will, Dad, that everything is above board." I stared at her, my gaze heavy, not answering right away. She didn't know how well I'd read her by now. I could see the way her fingers tapped on the package, betraying the nervous energy underneath her composed exterior. She was afraid that I might know more than I let on. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction just yet. "Everything is in order," I replied calmly, closing the distance between us by picking up the package. I ran my fingers over the sealed edges, pretending to inspect it, but all the while, I was imagining what she was really after. She wanted me to react, to reveal something, anything. It was almost laughable how badly they underestimated me. Elaine let out a nervous chuckle, the sound forced and hollow. "Of course I trust you, Dad. She paused, adjusting her posture. "Just wanted to make sure you're taken care of." She didn't mean it. I knew that now. "Elaine," I said quietly, placing the package back on the table, "I don't need anyone to take care of me. I've managed just fine on my own. You should know that." Her face stiffened for a moment, but then she regained her composure. "You're right, Dad. I just worry about you sometimes." She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. I didn't respond. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, watching her. For a long moment, the air between us was thick with unspoken tension. I wanted to tell her how deeply her words hurt me, how she had betrayed everything I had ever believed about family. But I didn't. I couldn't. It was too late for that. She finally stood, the chair scraping against the floor. "I'll leave you to it then," she said, as though she were dismissing me as an afterthought. "Just remember, we're here if you need anything." I barely nodded as she left, closing the door behind her with a soft click. I sat in silence for a long while, replaying the conversation in my head. She thought she was being clever, didn't she? But she had no idea how much control I had regained. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the power I was slowly reclaiming, bit by bit. That evening, I received a call from Thomas. His voice, usually so confident, was unusually tight. "Dad," he began, "there's something we need to talk about. Something's come up with the business." I had already heard the whispers about the company, how it was faltering. They couldn't see the writing on the wall, but I could. It was only a matter of time before it would crumble under the weight of their incompetence. Still, I let him continue. "What do you mean?" I asked, feigning confusion. "There are rumors, Dad. People are saying that the company is struggling. We need to get ahead of this." His voice cracked slightly, and I couldn't help but feel a fleeting sense of pity, but I hid it well. "Don't worry, Thomas," I said slowly. "I'm sure it'll work itself out." I could hear him shift on the other end of the line, the uncertainty in his voice betraying his anxiety. I need to know you're handling things. I don't want things to spiral out of control." I paused. "Things are fine. Everything's fine." It was the perfect response, vague enough to offer him nothing, but also enough to plant a seed of doubt. He hung up without another word, and I smiled to myself. The more they pressed, the more they revealed their fear. They were unraveling, and they didn't even know it. The next day, I went to meet with the lawyer who had helped me with the secret will. I wanted to be sure that everything was in place, that nothing could go wrong when the time came. I wanted to know that they would have no way of contesting the will, no chance of turning the tide in their favor. The lawyer, who had worked with me for years, was eager to reassure me that everything was legally sound. "You've done everything by the book, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice steady. "This will is ironclad. There's no way they can dispute it unless they can prove fraud, and even then, it would be difficult to make a case." I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It was done. The battle was over before it even began. But the true test was yet to come. I knew that when the time arrived, they would come to me with all their calculated lies and pleas. They would beg, they would plead, and they would try to twist my arm. But they would never know that their fate had already been sealed. They wouldn't even see it coming. Back at home, I settled into my routine. I went for my walks, had my meals, and spent my time in solitude. But I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was building toward something bigger, something more satisfying than I had imagined. Elaine and Thomas continued their charade, thinking they were still in control. But the truth was, they were already losing. The deeper they dug, the more they revealed their true nature, and the more they revealed their weakness. Soon, they would realize the truth. But by then, it would be too late to stop what had already been set in motion. It was only a matter of time before they would come for me. I could feel it in the way they started to act, in the tension they tried to hide behind their smiles. I had played the role of the unsuspecting, harmless father long enough. They were growing increasingly bold, thinking they had me cornered, and I couldn't let them continue with their smug confidence. For weeks, I observed. It wasn't just the visits anymore. It was the sudden phone calls, the casual checking-in moments, the veiled questions about my will, about the family business, about everything I had built. Elaine was the most obvious. She'd come over with a concerned face and her self-righteous speeches about the importance of family, but I could see right through her. And Thomas, who was always more direct, had started asking more pointed questions. They were trying to pull the strings of a puppet that had already cut the cords. The first real sign that they were making their move came when Elaine, on the pretense of checking my health, suggested I let her handle my finances. "Dad, we want to make sure everything is in order," she said. "You can't keep doing everything by yourself. We can help with the bills, the accounts. You've got enough on your plate." I could feel the hidden agenda behind her words. This wasn't about my health. This was about getting their hands on my financial records, about making sure they had a clear path to what they thought would soon be theirs. They didn't realize that I'd been careful. Every account, every asset, every property. It was all under my name, and it wasn't going anywhere until I said so. I turned her down politely, of course. "I'm fine, Elaine. I've got it under control. No need to worry." The words came out smooth, but inside, I was already scheming. I needed them to think they were still in control. I needed them to come to me, begging for what they thought would be their inheritance. I couldn't let them know the truth, that the game was already over, and they had no idea they were playing their final hand. It wasn't just Elaine's attempts to manage my finances that had me on high alert. It was Thomas's increasingly desperate calls. He'd been pushing harder than ever to get me involved in the family business. "Dad, you've got experience," he'd say. "We need you to step in. Things are getting rough." But the more he pushed, the more I pulled back. I could see through his attempts to help. He was trying to get me to sign papers, to give him access to everything. I knew the moment was approaching when they would make their big move. But I had already set things in motion. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me without a fight. I had made sure the attorney's office kept my secret will under lock and key, hidden from their prying eyes. and just in case they decided to go digging, I made sure there were no signs that anything had changed. But I needed more than just a secret will. I needed leverage. I needed a plan that would keep them from getting what they thought they deserved and leave them with nothing. So I began to act. I started laying the groundwork for the fallout. It was a calculated move, and I had to be patient. The first part of the setup involved ensuring that my business interests were protected, not just for my sake, but for the sake of those who had always supported me, the loyal partners who had helped build the empire from the ground up. They were the ones who deserved to benefit from my work, not my entitled children who had done nothing but scheme and take. I reached out to my closest allies in the business world, those who had helped me create the wealth I had. I arranged a meeting with each of them, telling them that things were about to change, that my family was trying to take over, and that I needed them to stand by me. They were all on board. We made sure every contract, every business agreement, was solid and locked down, ensuring that no one could come in and claim ownership once I was gone. The next piece of the puzzle was my property. The family home, the one my children had always assumed would be theirs, was mine, and mine alone. I made sure the deeds were carefully placed in a trust, naming only the people who had shown me loyalty, who had helped me when I was at my lowest, when they turned their backs. I had no intention of leaving anything to them. The most crucial part of the setup, however, was the hidden clause I had worked into my will. It wasn't just a matter of leaving everything to charity. It was about making sure they knew the depth of their betrayal. I didn't just want them to be left with nothing. I wanted them to understand that every move they had made to manipulate me had been noted, every greedy glance, every lie, every moment of disrespect. They had underestimated me, and they would pay for it. I set up an appointment with my attorney, the one who had helped me finalize the new will. We met in a small, discreet office on the edge of town, away from prying eyes. I trusted him. He had been with me for years, and I knew he wouldn't betray me. "Everything is in place, Mr. Thompson," he reassured me, his voice steady. "The legal protections are airtight. Even if they try to challenge it, they won't stand a chance." "I want them to understand, Mark," I said quietly. "I want them to feel the weight of what they've done." He nodded. "It's all set up. They'll never know what hit them." I felt a small sense of relief settle over me. I had done everything I could. Now, it was just a waiting game. The only thing left was for them to make their move. They were so sure they had me on the ropes that they had already won. But they were wrong. While I waited for the inevitable, I began setting the stage for their downfall in more subtle ways. I started pulling strings behind the scenes, quietly working to sever the last threads of control they thought they had. I had my business associates make strategic moves, ensuring that when they tried to take over, they would find nothing but resistance. I made sure to contact the banks, the property managers, and anyone else who could potentially block their access to what they thought would be theirs. All the while, I played the part of the frail, aging father. I acted as if I were helpless, as if I were losing my grip on reality. I let them think I was too old, too tired to understand what was going on. But inside, I was calculating every step, setting the stage for their final downfall. They thought I was weak. They thought I couldn't fight back. But in reality, I was already 10 steps ahead of them. The night I finalized everything was a quiet one. I sat in my chair, looking out at the neighborhood I had worked so hard to create. It was still mine, and when the time came, it would remain mine, just as everything else would. They had no idea how thoroughly I had planned their defeat. The setup was complete. They would come to me expecting everything. But when they saw the truth, when they learned what I had done, it would be too late. And when that day came, it would be the most satisfying moment of my life. The calm before the storm was almost suffocating. I spent my days in a haze of quiet contemplation, allowing the weight of everything I had set in motion to settle into place. My children had no idea that their every move was being anticipated. They thought I was just an old man, fading away, no longer a threat, but they were so far from the truth. It had been weeks since the last attempt they'd made to worm their way into my affairs, and I could tell they were growing anxious. Elaine kept calling, asking about the state of things, as if I were some fragile old man who needed constant reassurance. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed to be growing more desperate. I could hear it in his voice when he called to discuss the family business. His calls became more frequent, more insistent. "Dad, we need to act fast. The market's shifting. The company's losing value. Don't you see that?" I smiled to myself, knowing they had no idea just how much control I had already taken from them. The business they were scrambling to save, it was already a lost cause to them. The people who had supported me, the ones who had always stood by my side, had already positioned themselves in such a way that they would ride out the storm, while my children would be left floundering, trying to rebuild what they had, destroyed with their greed. It was clear to me now, Thomas and Elaine didn't care about the business. They didn't care about the legacy. They cared about the money, the inheritance they believed was waiting for them. That was their only concern. I wasn't their father anymore. I was just a means to an end. I began preparing them for the final confrontation, the moment when everything they had worked for would slip away. It would be a shock, a punch to the gut that they wouldn't see coming. My plan was simple but effective. I would pull the rug from under their feet when they least expected it, when they were convinced they had outwitted me. The first step was to begin pulling back the veil of secrecy. I knew they were growing, impatient, but I needed them to believe that nothing had changed. I started planting subtle signs, little clues that would suggest I was beginning to doubt my decision to leave them nothing. I started talking more about the family business, about the future. I let Thomas think I was considering handing it over to him. "Maybe you're right," I told him one day over the phone. "Maybe it's time for you to take charge. You've always been so determined." I could hear the hope in his voice, that unmistakable eagerness to believe that everything was still on track. He didn't realize that every word I spoke was part of the game. I needed him to believe that he was winning, to feel secure, to grow more confident. He couldn't be suspicious yet. The next step was orchestrating the perfect timing. I knew my children wouldn't make their move until they thought I was nearing the end. They were waiting for me to falter, to become too weak to stand on my own. And that was exactly when I would strike. I began pulling strings in the background, using my network of trusted allies to ensure that my children would find themselves locked out of their own plans. I'd already made arrangements with the business partners, who were all more than willing to back me up. I had my lawyer in place, ready to present the second will at exactly the right moment. My children would never know what hit them. As I prepared for the final blow, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led me here. My entire life, I had sacrificed for them, for Elaine and Thomas, for the family I had always tried to protect. I had built a legacy, a business, a home. And yet, they had turned on me when I needed them most, showing no loyalty, no compassion. They thought they could manipulate me, that they could walk all over me in my old age. They had no idea that I had been quietly preparing my own revenge. The day before the big meeting with my lawyer, I received a call from Elaine. She was almost pleading with me now, her voice trembling with something resembling desperation. "Dad, we've been talking. We really think it's time to consider your legacy. You don't want everything to fall apart, do you?" I let the silence linger for a moment, savoring the tension that crackled in the air. "I've thought about it, Elaine. You might be right. I'll make a decision soon," I said, my voice calm, measured. I could hear the hope return to her tone, like a dog that thought it was finally getting the treat. She had no idea that I was the one in control, that everything had already been decided. That night, I sat alone in my office, looking at the documents spread before me. The final preparations were all in place. The will was hidden, the trusts were set, the business was tied up in legal knots that they wouldn't be able to untangle. I could practically feel their frustration growing, their anxiety building as they tried again and again to push me into action. But I had them right where I wanted them. The final piece of the puzzle was the public reveal. I had already arranged for the will to be read at the family law office, a place where my children would think they had control. They would show up, confident and self-assured, ready to claim what they believed was theirs. But instead, they would walk into a trap. The lawyer would present the hidden will, the one that transferred everything I had worked for to the charities, and the people who had supported me. Elaine and Thomas would be left with nothing. The business, the house, the money. All of it would go to the causes I had always cared about, to the people who had shown me loyalty when I needed it most. They would be left to pick up the pieces of their shattered expectations, their greed, having cost them everything. And as I stood there, watching the moment unfold, I would feel a sense of satisfaction that only someone who had been betrayed could understand. They thought they were clever, thought they could outsmart me, but they had underestimated me, and in the end, it would be their downfall. The stage was set. All I had to do now was wait for the right moment, the moment when they would realize that the game was over, and they had lost. The day arrived, the moment I had been preparing for, the culmination of everything I had carefully laid out over the past few months. It was finally time for my children to face the consequences of their betrayal, their greed, and their complete disregard for everything I had worked for. They had no idea what was coming. And that, in itself, was the most satisfying part. I had arranged for the reading of the will to take place in a small private office at my lawyer's firm. It was quiet, neutral ground, a place where they would feel at ease, where they would believe they could simply walk in and claim what they thought was rightfully theirs. But what they didn't know was that the table had already been set. The stage was already in motion, and they were merely actors in a play they had no idea they were part of. Elaine and Thomas arrived separately, of course. I knew how important appearances were to them. They wanted to seem united, but they couldn't hide the underlying tension between them. They were both on edge, each of them thinking the other had a better chance of getting everything they wanted. Elaine, always the more calculating one, had probably convinced herself that she was in control, that she could manipulate the situation to her advantage. Thomas, the more blunt one, likely thought his persistence and brashness would be enough to push me into giving him what he wanted. Neither of them had any idea they had already lost. I watched them as they sat in the waiting area of the law office, a quiet tension hanging in the air. Their eyes flickered nervously as they glanced at the clock, wondering why the lawyer hadn't called them in yet. I couldn't help but smile to myself. They were anxious, and rightly so. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment they believed they had won. When the lawyer finally called them in, they walked through the door, both trying to put on a confident front. I could see right through them. Elaine had that perfect smile plastered on her face, the one she used when she was trying to appear in control. Thomas, as usual, was trying to appear unaffected, though his hands betrayed him, nervously shifting at his sides. I was already sitting in the center of the room, my hands folded neatly in front of me. They both took their seats across from me, the lawyer sitting between us, ready to read the will. For a moment, there was an eerie silence. Elaine cleared her throat, adjusting herself in the chair, while Thomas glanced at the lawyer impatiently. "Shall we begin?" the lawyer asked, his voice calm, his demeanor professional. I could see the excitement flicker in their eyes, and I felt a surge of satisfaction in knowing they still believed they were in control. What they didn't know was that this was the moment they would realize everything they had hoped for was slipping through their fingers. The lawyer opened the envelope with the will, glancing at me briefly, his eyes showing a flicker of respect. He had been with me for years and knew the depth of the plan. He began reading the will aloud, the legal jargon flowing smoothly, but all I could focus on was their faces. Elaine's expression remained neutral, but I could see her jaw tightening with anticipation. Thomas shifted in his seat, clearly eager to hear his name mentioned. As of this date, I, Richard Thompson, hereby revoke all previous wills and testamentary dispositions, the lawyer began, his voice steady. The words were formal, but I could see the tension growing in their eyes. I could feel the shift in the air, the moment when the realization began to settle into their minds. Section 1. I bequeath all financial assets, real estate, and businesses to the following organizations, the lawyer continued, not looking up from the document. A donation of 50% of my estate shall be allocated to various charities that have long been close to my heart. The remaining 50% shall be distributed to the following individuals. They leaned forward, their eagerness palpable, their faces suddenly lighting up with hope. But their hope quickly morphed into confusion. To my lifelong friends, business associates, and those who have stood by me in times of need, the lawyer continued, glancing briefly at me, as though acknowledging the finality of what was unfolding. This includes, but is not limited to, the following individuals. I saw them both glance at each other, their eyes narrowing. Their hope was beginning to crack. The names the lawyer listed were not theirs. They were not the names they had expected. There was no mention of them, no mention of the inheritance they had so carefully plotted for. Just as I had planned. The lawyer continued, each word weighing heavier than the last. To my children, Elaine and Thomas Thompson, I leave nothing. It was a moment that stretched out in time. The shock on their faces was immediate, and for a moment, there was silence. They sat frozen, unable to process what they had just heard. They had believed they were walking into a situation where they would simply be handed everything, their inheritance, their control, their victory. But instead, they were faced with a complete and utter loss. Thomas was the first to speak, his voice shaking with disbelief. "What do you mean, nothing? There must be some mistake," he said, his face contorting with anger. "This isn't right. You can't do this." Elaine, ever the strategist, quickly regained some semblance of control. "Dad, this isn't what we agreed upon. You've always said we'd inherit the business, the house, everything you built. You can't just take that from us." I sat back, watching them both with an expression of calm satisfaction. "I've taken nothing from you, Elaine. You took everything from me when you turned your backs on me, when you showed me no loyalty, no love, no respect. I've spent my life working for you, and yet you only saw me as a means to an end. Now, you'll learn the consequences of that." Thomas's face turned red with rage, and he shot out of his seat, banging his fist on the table. "You're a fool, Dad. You think this will make us respect you. You're nothing now. You're just—" "An old man with no family left to care for him." Elaine stood, pacing now, her eyes darting between the lawyer and me. "This can't be happening! We'll fight this! We'll contest the will! This is a mistake!" But as much as they raged, as much as they argued, they knew deep down that it was already over. There was no going back. They could contest the will all they wanted, but they would never win. Not this time. Not after everything I had set in motion. Their greed had cost them everything. As they fumed, I stood slowly, my back straight, my voice calm and firm. "You may not understand this now, but one day you will. And when you do, you will regret everything. Every moment you treated me like I was disposable." The lawyer stood as well, his face showing no emotion, his job complete. "I believe we're finished here," he said. "Mr. Thompson's will is final." Elaine and Thomas were left standing there, seething in disbelief, their world crumbling around them. They had underestimated me, believing their manipulation would work, believing their power would always be enough. But in the end, it wasn't. In the end, it was my turn to have the last laugh. And as I left the room, I could already hear the anger in their voices, the betrayal they felt. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done. They had lost everything, and I had taken back what was rightfully mine. The weeks that followed were quiet, almost peaceful. Elaine and Thomas tried to rally against the will, but their efforts were futile. The legal battles dragged on, but they quickly realized that nothing could change the finality of what had been set in motion. The business collapsed without their leadership. The house was sold, and everything they had hoped for vanished. They were left with nothing but their bitterness. As for me, I moved on, finding solace in knowing I had made my point. I had shown them what it meant to betray someone who had given them everything. In the end, my legacy wasn't about the money, the house, or the business. It was about the lesson, that greed and disloyalty have consequences, and that sometimes, the ones who have the power are the ones who stay quiet until it's time to act.